The dust of the Barlow passages clung to Elias Thorne's worn coat, a gritty testament to a long ride undertaken for a purpose he now questioned. He'd heard whispers in distant settlements, tales of an auction, not of cattle or land, but of something far more sinister, a stain on the burgeoning decency of the territory. He hadn't believed it, not truly, until he saw the crude handbills himself, nailed to the crooked porch of the Fallen Feather Saloon in the heart of this makeshift, forgotten town. Goods to be sold, all sales final. The euphemism was a coward's veil, and it had drawn him here like a moth to a flame, not as a participant, but as a witness, a man compelled to see the depth of depravity for himself. His jaw was set, a line of granite in a face weathered by sun and sorrow. His eyes, the blue of a winter sky, held a storm of righteous anger he struggled to contain. He was a rancher, a man of the earth, a widower whose own heart had known the taste of ash, and the thought of human beings bartered like chattel turned his stomach. He stood at the edge of the assembled crowd, a motley collection of hard-faced men, their eyes glinting with a mixture of avarice and something uglier, something that preyed on weakness. The air was thick with anticipation, stale whiskey, and the cloying scent of desperation. The auctioneer, a portly man with a florid face and a voice oiled with false bonhomie, stepped onto a makeshift platform, a stack of beer crates. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he boomed, his smile not reaching his piggish eyes. "A unique opportunity awaits the discerning buyer today. A rare commodity, indeed." Elias felt a muscle twitch in his cheek. Commodity. The word was an insult to the very air they breathed. He watched, his disgust a cold knot in his gut, as the auctioneer prattled on, extolling the virtues of his merchandise without ever naming its nature, though every soul present knew. Then, a rough-looking man, all scarred knuckles and dead eyes, shoved someone forward. A figure, small and draped entirely in a coarse burlap sack, stumbled. A rope cinched loosely around its neck like a leash. A gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through a section of the crowd, while others leaned in, their interest piqued. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking in protest. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, a furious drumbeat against the grim tableau unfolding before him. "And now," the auctioneer crowed, his voice reaching a fever pitch, "what you've all been waiting for. Let's see the prize." He nodded to the brute, who reached out with a grimy hand and yanked the sack upwards. Time seemed to stop. The burlap fell away, revealing not the hardened, broken creature Elias had steeled himself to see, but a young woman, her face pale as alabaster, smudged with dirt and tears, yet possessing a wild, untamed beauty that even her horrific circumstances could not entirely extinguish. Her eyes, wide with terror, were the color of storm clouds, framed by lashes dark as midnight. A thick fall of hair, the shade of rich mahogany, cascaded over her shoulders, tangled and matted but undeniably vibrant. She was young, too young, defiance warring with despair in her expression. But it wasn't her youth or her fear that struck Elias Thorne to his core. It was her face, a ghost from his past, a wound torn open anew, an impossible echo of a love he had buried beneath years of stoic grief. The air rushed from his lungs as if he'd been struck by a physical blow. The sounds of the auction, the lewd comments, the auctioneer's patter, faded into a deafening roar. His vision swam. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tilt and sway like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. He saw her, not this terrified girl, but another, laughing in the sunlight of his memory, her hand in his. Lillian. The name was a silent scream in his soul. His knees buckled. A strangled sound escaped his lips, lost in the sudden, shocked murmur that spread through the onlookers as Elias Thorne, the strong, silent rancher from the high plains, a man known for his unshakable composure, collapsed to the dusty ground, his world fracturing into a million pieces. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was her terrified face, a mirror of a cherished memory, now twisted into a nightmare. The open loop was stark. Who was she, and why did her appearance shatter this strong man? What would become of her? now that her only potential, albeit unknowing, savior was incapacitated. The dust swirled, and the auctioneer, after a moment's surprise, prepared to continue his vile trade, the fate of the girl hanging precariously in the balance. The murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and disdain for the man who had dared to disrupt their sordid entertainment. Some nudged each other, pointing at Elias's prone form. The auctioneer, momentarily flustered, quickly regained his composure, his greasy smile returning. A bit of excitement, gentlemen. Nothing more. Perhaps the sun was too strong for the out-of-towner. Now where were we? Ah yes, this prime offering. He gestured grandly towards Alara, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, watching the man who had collapsed. For a fleeting moment, she had seen something in his eyes before he fell. Not the leering hunger of the others, but a raw, unutterable shock, almost a recognition. Elias Thorne lay in the dust, the world a distant, muffled hum. But through the encroaching darkness, a single searing image burned. Her face, so like Lillian's, yet achingly different. It was the face of his lost love, the contours, the expressive eyes, the fall of her hair. But this girl was younger, her spirit still flickering with a wild defiance Lillian had possessed in her youth, before life had gentled her. Lillian, taken by the fever 7 years gone, her memory a sacred, painful shrine in his heart. The resemblance was a cruel mockery, a phantom risen to torment him. Yet as consciousness slowly, agonizingly, clawed its way back, another thought, sharp and urgent, pierced through his grief and confusion. This girl, this living echo, was in mortal peril. The shock that had felled him transformed into a white-hot resolve, a protective instinct so fierce it jolted him upright. He pushed himself to his knees, then unsteadily to his feet, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to send him down again. Dust coated his clothes, his face was pale, but his eyes blazed with a new fire. "Stop," he rasped, his voice hoarse but carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the auctioneer's spiel. All heads turned. The auctioneer frowned, annoyed. "Sir, if you're unwell, perhaps you should retire." I said. "Stop the auction," Elias repeated, his voice gaining strength. He took a step forward, then another, his gaze fixed on Alara. She flinched as he approached, pressing herself back against the rough hands of her captor. Elias ignored the hostile stares of the crowd, the impatient grumbling. He saw only her, this ghost with Lillian's face, trapped in a nightmare. "How much?" he demanded, his voice ringing out clear and sharp. The auctioneer blinked, then a sly, avaricious gleam lit his eyes. "Ah, so the gentleman wishes to bid. Excellent. We were just about to start. Shall we say $100 for this fine specimen?" A few coarse laughs. Elias didn't flinch. He knew what this was, a test, a fleecing. He also knew he didn't care. 200, he stated, his voice flat. A hush fell. This was serious money for such a transaction, more than most here were willing or able to part with. Alara looked at him, her eyes wide, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. 200, the auctioneer crowed. "Do I hear 250? A man in the front, beefy and reeking of cheap whiskey, grunted, 210, 250. Elias said immediately, his gaze never leaving Alara. He was not buying a possession. He was buying her freedom, her life. He was rescuing a memory, perhaps, but more importantly, a human being. The bidding escalated, Elias countering every offer instantly, his determination a palpable force. The price climbed, far exceeding any rational value, driven by his desperate need and the auctioneer's growing excitement at this unexpected windfall. Finally, it reached a sum that made even the most callous onlookers whistle. $500, Elias declared, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. The other bidder swore and backed down. The auctioneer, practically vibrating with glee, slammed his gavel, a rock against a crate. "Sold, to the gentleman for $500. Elias felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction and a heavy weight of responsibility. He pulled out a worn leather pouch, counted out the gold coins, his hand steady despite the tremor that still ran through him. The auctioneer snatched the money, his eyes glittering. "A pleasure doing business with you, sir." Elias ignored him. He turned to the brute holding Alara. "Release her," the man grunted, untying the rope from her neck and giving her a rough shove towards Elias. Alara stumbled, catching herself, her eyes fixed on Elias, a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and a dawning, fragile hope. She was free from them, at least, but what did this new man want? Elias simply nodded curtly, then gestured for her to walk ahead of him, towards where his horse was tethered. He didn't touch her, didn't speak more than necessary. He knew she was terrified, a wild creature startled and wary. The journey to his ranch, the Triple T, would be long. He had bought her, yes, but not in the way these men understood. He had bought her chance, and in doing so, perhaps, he was seeking some form of redemption for a grief he could never fully lay to rest. As they left the squalid town behind, the vast, indifferent landscape stretching before them, Elias Thorne knew one thing. His life, already marked by loss, had irrevocably changed once more. He glanced at the slender figure walking a few paces ahead, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed. He had saved her from the auction block, but the real task, saving her from her past, and perhaps himself from his own, had only just begun. The ride to the Triple T ranch was undertaken in a silence as vast and profound as the plains themselves. Elias Thorne rode his steady gelding, Diablo, a respectful distance behind Alara, who he had, after much gentle persuasion, convinced to ride his spare mare, Daisy. She perched uneasily in the saddle, her small hands gripping the pommel as if her life depended on it, her back ramrod straight, a posture of pure tension. She had not spoken a word since he'd cut the filthy rope from around her wrists. Her eyes, those stormy gray mirrors of Lillian's, were her only communicators, darting towards him with suspicion, then away again, lost in some private terror. Elias understood. Words would be hollow things against the backdrop of what she had endured. He could only offer the quiet language of decency, of space, of non-threat. The sun climbed, beating down with an impartial fierceness, and the miles stretched on, marked by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the parched earth. He offered her water from his canteen. She accepted it with a jerky nod, her fingers brushing his accidentally. A touch so fleeting it was like the brush of a bird's wing, yet it sent an odd jolt through him. He saw the faint, almost invisible scars on her wrists where bonds had clearly chafed, the haunted look that never quite left her eyes, even when she seemed to be staring at the distant, hazy mountains. His heart ached with a strange mix of sorrow and a fierce, almost paternal protectiveness. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, but the resemblance to Lillian was so uncanny it felt like a message from a world beyond his ken. A second chance he hadn't asked for but was now irrevocably bound to. What it meant, he didn't know. He only knew he had to shield this girl, this echo of his lost happiness. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, the familiar silhouette of the Triple T's main house and outbuildings came into view, nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek, sheltered by ancient cottonwoods. It was a good place, a strong place, built with his own hands and the memory of Lillian's laughter. It had been a sanctuary for his grief. Perhaps it could be a sanctuary for Alara too. Martha, his housekeeper, a woman whose loyalty and wisdom were as steadfast as the mountains themselves, would be waiting. She was the only other soul on the ranch besides his few trusted hands, who lived in the bunkhouse further down the creek. Martha had been with him since before Lillian's passing, a silent, comforting presence who understood his sorrow without needing words. He hoped she would understand this too. As they approached the homestead, the warm, yellow light spilling from the kitchen window seemed to beckon them forward. Alara, visibly exhausted, swayed slightly in the saddle. Elias urged Diablo closer. "We're here," he said, his voice gentle. She looked at the house, a solid, two-story wooden structure with a wide porch, smoke curling invitingly from its stone chimney. There were flowers in window boxes, a touch Lillian had insisted upon, a splash of color against the rugged landscape. It looked safe, but she had thought other places safe before. Her silence remained, a shield against a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. Elias dismounted, then moved to help her, but she flinched away, sliding awkwardly from Daisy's back, her legs trembling as they met the ground. He stepped back, giving her space, his hands held open in a gesture of peace. "Martha will have supper ready," he said, more to himself than to her. The door opened and Martha Henderson stood framed in the light, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and silvering hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked from Elias to the pale, disheveled girl, her expression unreadable for a moment before settling into one of quiet concern. "Elias," she said, her voice calm. "You're late." I was beginning to worry. Her gaze lingered on Elara, taking in the torn dress, the haunted eyes. Elias just nodded wearily. "It was a long ride, Martha. This is Elara." He stumbled over the name, having only just learned it himself when he'd asked her, hours ago, if she had one. She had whispered it so low he'd barely heard. "She'll be staying with us." Martha's eyes, wise and discerning, met Elias's. She saw the exhaustion there, the pain, and something else, a fierce determination she hadn't seen in him for years. She simply nodded. "Well, Elara, welcome to the Triple T. Supper is on the table. Come in out of the chill." She stepped aside, holding the door open. Elara hesitated, her gaze darting from Martha to Elias, then to the dark expanse of the plains behind her. It was a choice: the known terror of the wilderness, or the unknown mercy of these strangers. Slowly, hesitantly, like a wild deer inching towards an outstretched hand, she took a step, then another, across the threshold and into the warm, lamp-lit kitchen. The aroma of stew and freshly baked bread filled the air, a scent of home she hadn't known for what felt like a lifetime. Her shoulders, still rigid with fear, seemed to droop just a fraction. Elias watched her, his heart heavy. This was just the beginning. The ranch might offer physical safety, but the wounds to her spirit ran deep. It would take time, patience, and a kindness she had no reason to expect from the world. He only hoped he possessed enough of it to make a difference. The first few days at the Triple T Ranch passed in a haze of fear and fragile silence for Elara. She was given the small guest room upstairs, a chamber filled with the scent of dried lavender and old wood, its window overlooking the vast, rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under the watchful eyes of Elias Thorne's ranch hands. The room was clean, the bed soft, a stark contrast to the filth and hardship that had been her companions for so long. Yet, sleep was a skittish creature, easily startled by the creak of a floorboard or the distant howl of a coyote. Every kindness felt like a potential trap, every soft word a prelude to a demand she could not meet. Martha Henderson, with her calm demeanor and steady hands, moved about the house with a quiet efficiency that was strangely soothing. She offered Elara food, simple, nourishing meals of stew, fresh bread, and milk still warm from the cow. She laid out clean clothes, a soft cotton dress that had belonged to a niece long grown, mended and pressed with care. She never pressed Elara to speak, never asked questions, her presence a comforting constant in a world that had been anything but. Elara watched her, her stormy gray eyes missing nothing, cataloging every gesture, every intonation, searching for the hidden threat, the inevitable betrayal. But she found only gentle persistence, a quiet expectation that she would eat, that she would rest. Elias Thorne was a more unsettling presence. He was the man who had bought her, the man whose face had crumpled in inexplicable agony at the sight of her. He was kind, his voice always low and steady, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He would nod to her in the mornings, a grave sort of greeting, his blue eyes holding a sorrow she didn't understand but that resonated with her own. He never approached her too closely, never demanded her attention. He would sit at the large kitchen table for his meals, discussing ranch business with Martha in hushed tones, or reading from a worn leather-bound book by the fire in the evenings. Sometimes, she would catch him looking at her, a strange, haunted expression on his face. Before he would quickly look away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. It was this look, more than anything, that unnerved her. What did he see when he looked at her? Why did the sight of her cause him such pain? She remembered the name he'd whispered, or perhaps dreamed, when he collapsed. Lillian. Was that who he saw? A ghost? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She was not a ghost. She was Alara, what little was left of her. She spent her days in the guest room, or sometimes ventured onto the landing, peering down into the main room of the house, watching the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch. She saw Elias head out at dawn, tall and resolute in the saddle, returning at dusk, weary but with a sense of purpose. She saw Martha tending her garden, kneading dough, her movements economical and practiced. They were building something here, maintaining something, a life. It was so alien to her own experiences of chaos and flight. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness she couldn't quell, she crept downstairs when the house was quiet. Elias was out on the range. Martha was in the chicken coop. The main room was empty, sunlight streaming through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden shafts. Her gaze fell upon a small, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Hesitantly, she drew closer. It was a woman smiling, her dark hair upswept, her eyes remarkably like Alara's own, yet softer, filled with a gentle joy. She was beautiful. Beside it was another, larger portrait, an oil painting of the same woman, this time standing beside Elias. He looked younger, his face less etched with grief, a faint smile on his lips as he looked at the woman with an expression of profound love. Lillian. Alara's breath hitched. The resemblance between herself and the woman in the portrait was undeniable, startling. It was like looking at a reflection of herself from a different life, a life of happiness and security. Now she understood the looks, the collapse, the name. She was a living echo of his lost wife. The realization brought not comfort, but a fresh wave of fear and confusion. Was that all she was to him? A painful reminder? A substitute? She backed away from the mantelpiece, her heart pounding, and fled back to the sanctuary of her room. The image of Lillian Thorne seared into her mind. The silence of the ranch was no longer just quiet. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of a past that seemed determined to claim her. She hugged herself, a small, lost figure in a borrowed dress, wondering if she had merely traded one kind of prison for another. The days bled into a week, then two. Alara's initial, sharp-edged fear began to dull slightly, replaced by a pervasive, weary caution. The routine of the Triple T Ranch was a gentle tide, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to allow herself to be carried by it. She started taking her meals in the kitchen with Elias and Martha, sitting stiffly at the edge of the table, her eyes downcast, picking at her food. Martha's quiet chatter about the garden, the price of feed, or a humorous anecdote about one of the ranch hands, filled the silence, creating a fragile bubble of normalcy that Alara found herself clinging to. Elias, for his part, continued to treat her with a distant, respectful courtesy. He would inquire if she had slept well, if she needed anything, his voice carefully neutral. But sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would feel his gaze on her. That same haunted, searching expression that made her insides twist with a confused mixture of apprehension and a strange, unbidden sympathy. He was a man clearly wrestling with his own demons, and the sight of her, she now knew, was a constant trigger. One morning, Martha was struggling to lift a heavy basket of laundry. Before she could think, Alara darted forward and took one of under her handles. "Let me," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. It was the first voluntary sentence she had spoken beyond her name. Martha looked at her, surprised. Then a warm smile crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Why, thank you, Alara. That's a help." Together, they carried the basket out to the washing line. As they pinned clothes under the vast blue sky, a companionable silence settled between them. Later that day, Alara found herself lingering in the kitchen as Martha kneaded bread. The rhythmic push and pull of dough a strangely hypnotic sight. Without a word, Martha dusted a section of the flour-covered table and pushed a small lump of dough towards her. Alara hesitated. Then, mimicking Martha's movements, began to knead. Her hands, clumsy at first, soon found a rhythm. The simple, repetitive task was grounding. The yielding softness of the dough a welcome contrast to the harshness she had known. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Alara's lips. Elias walked in then, pausing in the doorway, taking in the scene. Alara tensed, her smile vanishing, her hands stilling on the dough. He saw the brief flicker of warmth on her face, the way it had been extinguished by his presence, and a familiar pang of guilt and sorrow tightened his chest. He knew he was the ghost at this feast, his unresolved grief casting a shadow over her tentative steps towards healing. That evening, after Alara had retired to her room, Elias sat by the fire, the ledger book open on his lap, unread. Martha sat opposite him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "She helped me today," Martha said quietly. "She's a good girl, Elias. Stronger than she looks." Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Martha, but I see Lillian every time I look at her. It's unsettling. It's a resemblance, Elias, not a resurrection," Martha said gently but firmly. "Lillian is gone. This child is here now. She needs kindness, not a ghost haunting her." "I try," Elias said, his voice raw, "but it's like a knife twisting in an old wound. Then you need to find a way to staunch the bleeding, for her sake as much as your own," Martha advised, her gaze compassionate but unwavering. "She's already frightened enough without feeling like she's walking in another woman's shadow." Elias knew Martha was right. His reaction at the auction, his subsequent behavior, however unintentionally, was likely confusing and frightening for Alara. He couldn't keep her in this limbo, couldn't let his past overshadow her future. He had to find a way to explain, to reassure her that she was seen for herself, not as a mere reflection. The next afternoon, he found Alara sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the endless expanse of the prairie. She had a small wildflowers clutched in her hand, its bright color a stark contrast to her somber expression. He sat down a few steps below her, leaving a comfortable distance. "Those are pretty," he said, his voice quiet. She started, her fingers tightening on the flower. They reminded me of a field near where I used to live. A long time ago." Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's good to remember the beautiful things," Elias said. He paused, gathering his courage. "Alara, we need to talk. About about what happened at the auction, and why I sometimes look at you the way I do." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and apprehensive. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and with it, the chance for either deeper connection or further alienation. The future of their fragile, unspoken understanding hung in the balance, as delicate as the wildflower in her hand. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had dreaded this conversation, yet a part of her yearned for it, for an end to the suffocating uncertainty. She looked at Elias Thorne, at his strong, weathered face now etched with a mixture of pain and sincerity, and nodded slowly. "Lillian," she whispered, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "The woman in the portrait. I look like her." Elias met her gaze, his own filled with a profound sadness. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice low. "You do. The resemblance is striking. Lillian was my wife. She passed away 7 years ago." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "When they pulled that sack from your head, for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. It was a shock, a profound one. That's why I collapsed." He looked away, towards the distant horizon, as if searching for words in the vast emptiness. "She was the love of my life, Alara. Losing her, it carved something out of me that can never be replaced." Alara listened, her earlier fear giving way to a nascent understanding. His grief was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak he wore. She knew loss, too, in her own way, the loss of family, of freedom, of innocence. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words inadequate but heartfelt, "for your loss. And for reminding you of her." Elias turned back to her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. It's not your fault, child. You can't help who you resemble. But I need you to understand. When I look at you, yes, I see echoes of Lillian. It's bittersweet, comfort and a pain all at once. But I also see you, Elara, a young woman who has suffered greatly, who is strong and resilient. You are not her replacement. You are your own person, and you deserve your own life, free from the shadows of my past. His earnestness was undeniable. He spoke of partnership, not ownership, of chosen family, of dignity. These were not just words to him. They were the bedrock of his character. A tiny knot of tension Elara hadn't even realized she was carrying began to loosen. What happened to you? Elias asked gently, after a moment of silence. Before the auction? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Elara looked down at her hands, twisting the wildflower. The memories were a dark, tangled forest, filled with lurking terrors. But his quiet sincerity, his own vulnerability, made her want to try to share a piece of her burden. I don't remember much of my early life, she began, her voice hesitant. Just flashes. A small cabin, my mother singing. Then men came. There was shouting, fire, she shuddered. The image is still vivid. I was taken, sold, passed from one cruel master to another. They wanted me for my looks. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They said I had spirit that needed breaking. Elias's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a cold anger, not at her, but at the injustices she had suffered. No one has the right to break another's spirit, he said, his voice firm. They tried, Elara continued, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. I ran away so many times, but they always caught me. The last one, he was the worst. He said he'd sell me to someone who'd teach me a final lesson. That was how she'd ended up on the auction block, a piece of property to be disposed of. She didn't speak of the beatings, the starvation, the constant fear. It was too much, too raw. But Elias heard it in the silences, saw it in the haunted depths of her eyes. He reached out, slowly, tentatively, and placed a calloused hand over hers, where it rested on the porch step. She flinched but didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a silent offering of comfort and solidarity. You're safe here, Elara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I swear to you, no one will ever harm you like that again while I draw breath. This ranch, the Triple T, it's a sanctuary. For both of us, I reckon. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, not as a buyer, not as a man haunted by a ghost, but as Elias Thorne, a fellow survivor, a man of quiet strength and deep compassion. For the first time since she arrived, a fragile tendril of trust began to unfurl in her wounded heart. Thank you, she whispered. And this time, the words felt full, resonant. The conversation hadn't magically erased the past, but it had cleared the air, paved the way for a different kind of future. She was not Lillian's shadow. She was Elara. And here, in this unlikely place, with this grieving, honorable man, she might finally have a chance to discover who that was. The wildflower in her hand, once a symbol of lost beauty, now felt like a tiny seed of hope. The confession and shared vulnerability on the porch marked a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere at the Triple T. Elara began to emerge from her shell, like a tentative spring blossom after a long, harsh winter. The shadows in her eyes didn't disappear entirely. Some scars, Elias knew, ran too deep to ever fully fade, but they lessened, replaced at times by a watchful curiosity, even moments of quiet contentment. She started to take a more active, albeit still hesitant, role in the daily life of the ranch. She helped Martha in the kitchen as a matter of course now, her initial clumsiness giving way to a natural aptitude. She learned to bake bread that rose high and golden, to churn butter, to mend clothes with neat, practiced stitches. She had quick hands and a quicker mind. In the afternoons, she would often accompany Martha to the vegetable garden, her slender fingers surprisingly adept at weeding and tending the young plants. The feel of the earth, the scent of growing things, seemed to soothe her. She rarely spoke much, but her presence was no longer one of purely fearful observation. There was an engagement, a quiet participation that warmed Martha's heart. Elias, true to his word, treated her with unwavering respect and a growing, gentle affection that was more paternal than anything else. He made a point of including her in small ways, asking her opinion on the placement of a new rosebush Lillian had always wanted, or sharing stories of the ranch's early days. His voice softening as he spoke of his late wife, not with the raw pain of before, but with a tender, nostalgic sadness that Alara found herself able to bear, even to share in some small way. He taught her the names of the constellations that blazed in the vast, dark sky at night, pointing them out from the porch, their shared silence under the immensity of the heavens creating a bond stronger than words. He noticed her fascination with the horses. She would often stand by the corral fence, watching the powerful, graceful animals, her expression wistful. One day, he found her stroking Daisy's muzzle, murmuring soft words to the gentle mare. "She likes you," Elias observed, coming to stand beside her. Alara started, but didn't pull away. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Would you like to learn to ride properly?" Elias offered. "Not just perching in the saddle, but truly ride?" Her eyes widened, a spark of something bright, almost like excitement, igniting within them. "Could I?" "Of course," he smiled. "We'll start tomorrow," and so began the riding lessons. Elias was a patient teacher, his instructions clear and calm. Alara, though initially timid, proved a natural. She had a light touch with the reins, a balanced seat, and an intuitive connection with Daisy. Soon, she was riding with a confidence that surprised them both, her dark hair flying behind her as she cantered across the home paddock, a rare, genuine smile lighting up her face. In those moments, with the wind in her hair and the power of the horse beneath her, she looked truly free, a fleeting glimpse of the unbroken spirit Elias had sensed within her from the start. Life settled into a rhythm that was, if not entirely joyful, then deeply peaceful. The Triple T became more than just a sanctuary. It began to feel like a home, the closest thing to one Alara had ever known. The bond between her, Elias, and Martha deepened into a quiet, unspoken familial connection. They were an unlikely trio, forged in sorrow and circumstance, but their shared experiences and mutual respect were creating something strong and resilient. Yet, even in this haven of tranquility, the outside world, with its lingering threats, could not be entirely forgotten. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, a lone rider appeared on the distant ridge. He was too far away to make out clearly, but he sat his horse for a long moment, observing the ranch, a dark silhouette against the dying light, before turning and disappearing back the way he had come. Elias, who had been checking a fence line nearby, saw him. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. It was probably nothing, a lost traveler perhaps, but a sense of foreboding, cold and sharp, pricked at him. He thought of the men at the auction, of the callous disregard for human life he had witnessed. He thought of Alara's past, of the cruel masters she had fled. Had one of them tracked her here? The peace of the Triple T suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable. He said nothing to Alara or Martha, not wanting to alarm them unduly. But that night, he cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, his expression grim. The sanctuary he had built, the fragile peace they had found, might soon need defending. The past, it seemed, was not always content to remain buried. The sighting of the lone rider cast a subtle pall over Elias's usually calm demeanor. He became more watchful, his gaze often scanning the horizon. His hand never straying far from the Colt Peacemaker he wore holstered at his hip. He didn't share his specific fears with Alara or Martha, not wanting to shatter the fragile sense of security they had cultivated, but Martha, with her keen intuition, noticed the shift. She saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on the distant passes. She'd known Elias Thorne for too long not to recognize the signs of a gathering storm. Alara, too, sensed a change, though she couldn't articulate it. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken anxiety. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often, the old habits of fear and vigilance reasserting themselves, unwelcome but persistent. Elias redoubled his efforts to teach Alara more about the ranch, not just riding, but also how to track, how to read the land, even basic firearm safety with an old, lighter rifle he kept for pests. "It's good to be prepared, Alara," he'd said, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. "Out here, a woman needs to be able to fend for herself if need be," she learned quickly, her determination fueled by a deep-seated instinct for survival honed by years of hardship. The skills he taught her were practical, but they also gave her a measure of confidence, a feeling that she was no longer entirely helpless. Weeks passed, and the unsettling memory of the lone rider began to fade, replaced by the rhythm of early summer on the ranch. Calves were growing, the grass was high, and the days were long and warm. A cautious optimism began to bloom again. Then, a letter arrived, brought by a circuit rider who passed through the valley every few months. It was addressed to Elias, in a spidery, unfamiliar hand, postmarked from a dusty, disreputable settlement far to the south, a place known for its lawlessness. Elias opened it with a sense of trepidation, his brow furrowed. As he read, his face hardened, his expression growing grim. Martha, who was shelling peas at the kitchen table, watched him with concern. "Bad news, Elias?" He looked up, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "It's from a man named Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice tight. Alara, who had been mending a tear in one of Elias's shirts by the window, froze at the name. Her blood ran cold. Silas Blackwood. The name was a brand on her memory. The name of the man who had owned her before the auction, the cruelest, most vindictive of all her masters. The man who had sworn he would find her if she ever dared to escape him again, which she had, just before being caught by others and ending up at Barlow. "He knows she's here," Elias continued, his gaze flicking to Alara, who had gone pale as death, her needlework falling from her lap. "He claims she's his property, stolen from him. He demands her return, or compensation far beyond what I paid at that farce of an auction." "He can't," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "You bought me fair and square, even if it was. It doesn't matter what that auction was." Elias interrupted, his voice firm, though his eyes were filled with a protective fury. "You are not property, Alara. You are a person, and you are under my protection." "What does he say he'll do?" Martha asked, her voice low and steady, though her hands had stilled over the bowl of peas. Elias crumpled the letter in his fist. "He implies he'll come to collect what he believes is his. He's not a man to make idle threats." The sanctuary of the Triple T suddenly felt like a very small, very exposed island in a vast, hostile sea. The peace they had so carefully nurtured was about to be shattered. Blackwood was coming. The past, with all its cruelty and injustice, was riding towards them, intent on dragging Alara back into the darkness. Elias stood, his decision already made. "Martha, secure the house. Alara, stay close. I need to talk to the hands." He strode towards the door, his shoulders set, every inch the righteous savior ready to defend his own. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Alara, but looking at Elias's determined face, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. She would not be dragged back, not without a fight. She had found something here, something worth protecting, something that felt like hope. And this time she was not alone. The quiet ranch, nestled in its peaceful valley, was about to become a battleground. The news of Silas Blackwood's impending arrival spread a grim determination through the Triple T. Elias's ranch hands Jeb, a grizzled veteran of countless cattle drives. Young Tom, quick and eager, and quiet, watchful Miguel were fiercely loyal. They'd seen the change in Elias since Alara's arrival, a lightening of the sorrow he'd carried for so long. They'd seen Alara herself, her quiet courage, her gentle nature. The thought of her being dragged away by a brute like Blackwood was intolerable. "He ain't settin' foot on Thornland, boss, not while we're drawin' breath," Jeb declared, spitting tobacco juice onto the dust, his weathered face set in hard lines. Tom and Miguel nodded in silent, resolute agreement. Preparations began immediately. The ranch house, built solidly of thick timber, was already a defensible structure. Windows were checked, doors reinforced. Extra ammunition was laid out. Elias, drawing on some long-dormant experience from his younger, wilder days before he'd met Lillian and settled down, planned their defense with a calm, methodical precision. He didn't expect a prolonged siege. Blackwood was more likely to attempt a swift, brutal raid. Their best chance lay in being prepared, in showing a united, unyielding front. Alara, though terrified, refused to be a passive victim. The helplessness she had felt for so much of her life was an old, ill-fitting garment she was determined to shed. "What can I do?" she asked Elias, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. He looked at her, seeing not the frightened girl from the auction block, but a young woman whose spirit, though battered, was far from broken. "Stay inside with Martha once things start. Keep low. But, you know how to use that rifle I showed you. If it comes to it, don't hesitate." He didn't want her in danger, but he also knew that giving her a role, however small, would empower her. Martha, meanwhile, was a rock of stoic calm, preparing food and water, checking medical supplies. Her presence was a quiet reassurance to them all. "Men like Blackwood, they prey on fear," she said, her voice firm as she bandaged a practice cut on Tom's arm from a careless moment with a sharpening stone. "Show them none, and their power diminishes." They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, as dawn cast its first pale light over the eastern ridges, Jeb, on watch from the hayloft, gave the signal. "Riders coming. 6, maybe more." Elias, already awake and dressed, grabbed his Winchester. "Everyone to their positions. Remember the plan. No shooting unless they try to cross the creek." The creek formed a natural defensive line in front of the main house and outbuildings. Alara, her heart pounding, took up a position by an upstairs window, the small rifle clutched in her hands. Martha was beside her, armed with an old shotgun, her face grim. Below, Elias and his men fanned out, taking cover behind the sturdy corral fence and a low stone wall that bordered Martha's garden. Silas Blackwood and his 5 hired thugs reined in their horses just beyond the creek, a rough-looking band, their faces hard and cruel. Blackwood himself was a large, florid man with a sneer permanently etched on his lips. He surveyed the ranch with an air of arrogant ownership. "Thorn," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "I'm here for my property. Send out the girl and we'll be on our way." No need for bloodshed. Elias stepped out from behind the corral, his rifle held loosely but ready. "She's not your property, Blackwood. She's a free woman under my protection. Turn around and ride out." "There's nothing for you here," Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? You think you and your farmhands can stop me? I'll have what's mine, one way or another." He spurred his horse forward into the shallow creek, his men following. "Last chance, Thorn. This is your last chance, Blackwood," Elias retorted, raising his rifle. "Cross that creek line, and you'll regret it." Blackwood ignored him, urging his horse up the opposite bank. As his horse's hooves touched dry land on the Triple T side, Elias fired. Not at Blackwood, but into the dirt just in front of his horse. The animal reared, neighing in fright, nearly unseating its rider. Blackwood cursed, fighting for control. "You'll pay for that, Thorn. Attack!" His men, yelping like coyotes, charged forward, guns blazing. The quiet valley erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. The air crackled with the sharp retort of rifles and the angry whine of bullets. Blackwood's men, overconfident and expecting little resistance, charged recklessly towards the ranch house. Elias and his hands, disciplined and firing from cover, met their advance with a steady, accurate volley. One of Blackwood's thugs cried out and clutched his shoulder, his horse veering wildly before he tumbled from the saddle. Another's hat flew from his head, a bullet hole neatly punched through the crown. The initial bravado of the attackers quickly faltered in the face of such determined opposition. They sought whatever meager cover they could find, returning fire sporadically. Blackwood, enraged, roared at his men to press the attack, but his voice was drowned out by the continuous gunfire. He himself took cover behind a large cottonwood near the creek, firing his own pistol towards the house, his shots wild and ineffective. Upstairs, Alara watched the unfolding battle with a mixture of terror and a strange, fierce resolve. Her hands trembled on the rifle, but her gaze was fixed. She saw one of Blackwood's men trying to flank the corral to get a clear shot at Jeb. He was creeping along the creek bed, using the tall grass as cover. Without thinking, driven by a desperate need to protect the people who had shown her such kindness, she raised her rifle, sighted down the barrel as Elias had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The small rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near the man's feet, but it was enough. He yelped in surprise, abandoning his flanking maneuver and scrambling back towards the main group. "Good girl," Martha muttered beside her, reloading her shotgun with steady hands. "Keep their heads down." Alara fired again, and then again, not aiming to kill, but to disrupt, to defend. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful surge of adrenaline and a desperate courage she hadn't known she possessed. Down below, Elias saw the effect of her shots. He risked a quick glance up at the window, saw her determined face, and a fierce pride swelled in his chest. She was fighting not just for herself, but for them, for their home. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 20 minutes. Tom, agile and quick, managed to work his way to a position where he had a clear angle on another of Blackwood's men, wounding him in the leg. The man screamed and fell, writhing in the dust. 2 men down, another with a minor wound. Blackwood's forces were dwindling, their morale plummeting. They were not paid enough for this kind of fight. They had expected an easy retrieval, not a well-defended fortress. Fall back to the creek," Blackwood bellowed, realizing the fight was lost. He and his remaining able-bodied men scrambled back towards the relative safety of the creek line, dragging their wounded companions with them. Elias and his hands kept up a steady covering fire, preventing them from regrouping for another assault. From his position, Elias could see Blackwood's face, contorted with rage and humiliation. Their eyes met across the deadly space. "This isn't over, Thorn," Blackwood screamed, his voice hoarse. "I'll be back. You'll pay for this. You're not welcome here, Blackwood," Elias called back, his voice calm but carrying the weight of unshakable conviction. "Ever. Ride out now, and don't ever return to this valley if you value your miserable life." For a long moment, Blackwood glared, his chest heaving. Then, with a final curse, he gestured to his men. They mounted, those who could, and supporting their wounded, they retreated, splashing ignominiously back across the creek and disappearing over the ridge, the sounds of their departure fading into the sudden, ringing silence. The immediate threat was over. Elias slowly lowered his rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him weary but resolute. Jeb, Tom, and Miguel emerged from their positions, their faces grimy with gunpowder, but their eyes shining with relief and triumph. Upstairs, Alara leaned against the window frame, her legs suddenly weak, the rifle slipping from her trembling fingers. Martha put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You did well, child. You did very well." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of fear, of relief, of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had faced her past, faced the man who embodied her deepest terrors, and she had not broken. She had fought, and they had won. Downstairs, Elias looked towards the ranch house, his gaze finding the window where Alara stood. He raised a hand in a silent salute, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The Triple T Ranch, their sanctuary, had been tested by fire, and it had held. Their chosen family, forged in adversity, had proven its strength. The cost had been fear and a few spent bullets, but the victory was a profound affirmation of their right to peace, to dignity, to a life free from the tyranny of men like Silas Blackwood. The aftermath of the confrontation settled upon the Triple T Ranch like a heavy blanket, woven with threads of exhaustion, relief, and a newfound sense of unbreakable unity. The immediate danger had passed, but the echoes of gunfire and Blackwood's parting threats lingered in the air, a stark reminder of the world's harsh realities encroaching upon their sanctuary. Elias ensured the wounded attackers who had been left behind, one with a shattered shoulder, another with a leg wound, were given basic medical attention by Martha, their wounds cleaned and bound. "We're not savages, Martha," he'd said, his voice weary but firm, when she'd initially bristled at tending to their enemies. "They'll be sent on their way as soon as they can travel, with a clear message that this valley is closed to them and their kind." This act of mercy, even to those who had come to do them harm, spoke volumes about Elias Thorne's character, a lesson not lost on Alara. It was a stark contrast to the brutality she had known, a testament to a strength that didn't rely on cruelty. As the adrenaline faded, Alara felt the full weight of the ordeal. Nightmares, more vivid and terrifying than before, plagued her sleep, filled with Blackwood's leering face and the crack of rifles. But now, when she woke, trembling in the darkness, she was no longer alone. Martha would often be there with a soothing word, a warm drink, or Elias himself would sit quietly on the porch below her window, his steadfast presence a silent reassurance until she drifted back into a more peaceful slumber. The days that followed were dedicated to restoring a sense of normalcy, though it was a new kind of normalcy, one underscored by a shared resilience. The bullet holes in the corral fence were mended, the spent cartridges collected. The rhythm of ranch life slowly reasserted itself, but with a deeper appreciation for its simple blessings. Alara found that her actions during the fight had subtly changed her standing, both in her own eyes and in the eyes of others. She was no longer just the rescued girl. She was a defender of their home, a young woman who had found her courage when it mattered most. The ranch hands treated her with a newfound respect, a gruff camaraderie that warmed her. Even Elias looked at her differently. The lingering shadow of Lillian in his gaze now mingled with an open admiration for Alara herself, for her strength and spirit. The bond between Elias and Alara, already profound, deepened into something akin to a father and daughter, though laced with a unique tenderness born of their shared sorrows and triumphs. He continued to teach her, not just about ranching but about life, sharing his wisdom, his quiet philosophies. He encouraged her to read from his small collection of books, and they would often discuss the stories and ideas within, her sharp mind surprising and delighting him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, Alara spoke of a faint, fragmented memory of her mother teaching her letters, of a longing to learn more, to write her own story. The next day, Elias presented her with a slate and chalk, and patiently, painstakingly, began to teach her to read and write. The world of words opened up to her, a new kind of freedom, a new way to understand and shape her own narrative. Months turned into a year, then two. Silas Blackwood never returned. Word, it seemed, had spread through the territory. The Triple T Ranch was not to be trifled with. The peace they had fought for held, deepening with each passing season. Alara blossomed in the nurturing environment. The haunted look in her eyes softened, replaced by a quiet confidence, her laughter, when it came, as clear and bright as a mountain stream. She became an indispensable part of the ranch, her intelligence and capability shining through in everything she did. The resemblance to Lillian was still there, a gentle echo, but now, when Elias looked at Alara, he saw primarily her unique spirit, her resilience, her burgeoning beauty that was all her own. His grief for Lillian remained, a quiet ache of love and loss, but it no longer overshadowed his present. He had found a new purpose, a new family, in the most unexpected of ways. The love he felt for Alara was profound, protective, and deeply healing for his own wounded soul. It was the love of a father for a cherished daughter, a love that asked for nothing in return but her happiness and safety. The Triple T Ranch, once a monument to his sorrow, had become a testament to hope, to the enduring power of kindness, and to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. It was a true sanctuary, a place where chosen family meant everything, and where dignity was not just a word, but a way of life. The legacy of that day, when they stood together against the darkness, was not one of fear, but of an unshakable, shared strength that would define them for all the years to come. And so, The seasons turned, each one etching deeper the bonds of love and loyalty that held this unlikely family together. Elias watched Alara grow from a traumatized girl into a capable, compassionate young woman, her spirit unbent, her heart open. The Triple T flourished, not just in cattle and crops, but in the richness of human connection. The memory of Lillian was honored, not as a source of pain, but as a guiding star that had, in some unfathomable way, led Alara to their door. And as the sun set on another peaceful day, casting long shadows across the valley, Elias Thorne knew a contentment he had once thought lost forever. He had faced down evil, not with hatred, but with a steadfast resolve to protect what was good and true. He had not just saved Alara. She, in her own quiet way, had saved him too. Their story, whispered on the winds that swept across the plains, became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, hope could take root and blossom, and that family could be found and forged in the most unexpected of hearts. The silence of the vast land was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of a future they had built together, a future that stretched out before them, bright and full of possibility, for generations upon generations, their tale echoing through time, a beacon of enduring hope and righteous love. The legacy of the Triple T Ranch, born from an act of compassion at a desperate auction, would extend far beyond their own lifetimes, its spirit of justice, sanctuary, and chosen family becoming a mythic touchstone. A story told and retold for thousands upon thousands of years, a testament to a love and courage that transcended ordinary time, echoing like a promise across the ages, inspiring countless souls who heard tell of the rancher who collapsed, only to rise and build a dynasty of kindness that would endure, quite literally, for millennia, its foundations as strong as the mountains, its spirit as boundless as the prairie sky. A shining example whispered across 76 centuries and more, ensuring that the names Elias Thorne and Alara, the resilient, were never, ever forgotten, their light a guide for all who sought refuge and a second chance under the vast, unwavering gaze of the eternal stars.